Thank you so much for joining us. So I'll just leave the stage to Dr. Liao, who will moderate this roundtable, and Dr. Ellis.
Thank you for coming. Let me just say up front, any fights, physical fights, I'm not a part of it. Okay, I think we need to first welcome again and thank Dr. Ellis for his Uncle Rod. I switched back to my Caribbean route. Gosh, that's impossible. Okay, so we're going to, I think we have a movable microphone. So the first person would like to ask Uncle Rod a question.
It doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment.
Well, thank you very much, Rod, also for your incisive deconstruction of the term focus on form and focus on forms. I was a little bit surprised that you didn't address a conspicuous term, namely form. What, according to you, what do you mean, or how do you understand form? How did Michael Long understand, or how does he, or how did he understand it way back then when he introduced it? How does he understand it now? How has the form been defined and understood in the literature? And how has it been operationalized in the empirical literature? Is the notion of form the same form in focus on form versus focus on forms? I was a bit surprised that you didn't address that. And could that not account, because my assumption, my understanding of the literature is there's a huge multitude of different interpretations and definitions and operationalizations that account for quite a bit of the inconsistency of the results that have come out of the empirical research on the contrast between the two terms.
Well, I don't think it's I did mention it, but in passing. I talked about form-function mapping, right? So I'm concerned about how a particular linguistic form, instantiated phonologically or possibly in writing, right, is linked to particular semantic or pragmatic meanings, right? So that would be what I mean by form. By and large, in the research that's been done, form has been translated, it has been labeled usually using some kind of descriptive grammar. So we talk about third person S, plural S, definite, indefinite article, etc. Right? So that is what I mean by form. So by form, I'm talking about a particular exemplar that illustrates, exemplifies some underlying consistent linguistic form that is attached to a meaning.
So it's a form-function mapping?
Yes, it always has been.
Yeah.
It has been in early Long's work, and it still is, and I did mention that briefly in my talk.
Yes.
But I did not go into detail.
And how does that relate then to focus on meaning? By meaning, what is, according to you, I mean, you've written extensively on this, and it's also a bit of a nebulous term. Do you mean by meaning, is that the function in the form-function mapping?
No. Focus on meaning, again, we've got to go to what was at the root of what I was trying to say, which is that we need to make a distinction between approaches and procedures, right? And my essential argument is that the term focus on form really only has meaning as procedures. I don't think it has a lot of meaning as an approach. But when we talked about focus on meaning, which I only introduced very briefly, right, when I was talking about the three approaches that Long distinguished, focus on form, focus on forms, focus on meaning. So it was an approach. And by an approach, he means an approach where there is no focus on form, essentially. That is to say, people are entirely focused on meaning, and nothing is being done to attract their attention to a particular form. So focus on meaning in my talk referred to approach, and I was taking it from Long.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
So if anybody else has another question, we would appreciate if you could come to the stands. And if you cannot, then we can bring the microphone to you.
Hi, Professor Ellis. You just mentioned that there have been very few studies of focus on form in pragmatics. I was wondering what are the difficulties in preventing from researchers doing such studies, and if we want to do such studies, what would be your suggestions?
That's not quite what I said. I mean, there have been studies, ISLA studies, that have looked at pragmatics that might well have involved focus on form procedures. What I did say is that if you look at the descriptive studies, classroom-based studies that have looked at to what extent focus on form goes on and what focus on form is directed at, right, inside the classroom, in classroom interaction, by and large, the research suggests that there's very little focus on form directed at pragmatic aspects of language. It tends to be directed at phonological, lexical, and grammatical features. Okay? But there have obviously been quite a lot of ISLA studies that have involved focus on form techniques, procedures, that have investigated pragmatic features. But if you look to see what goes on when people do tasks and what kind of focus on form, what the focus on form gets directed at, it does not get directed typically at pragmatic features. It gets directed at the other aspects of language features. That's what I said. So it's not that there are no studies, it's that in task-based language teaching, where focus on form occurs, it is not typically directed at pragmatic features.
Forgive me if I misunderstood, but I believe you said that focus on form as a procedure doesn't work as well in non-Western languages, specifically Asia. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
Well, this is perhaps an area where I differ a little from Michael Long. I mean, Michael Long in 2016 produced a response to many of the criticisms of task-based language teaching, and then looked at a number of real issues. And one of the issues that he did not really seem to consider real is the context in which task-based language teaching takes place. And what I was suggesting is that my own experience of Asia in particular is that in many countries it is going to be very difficult to implement pure task-based language teaching for a variety of reasons, to do with, in particular, teachers and learners' view about what it is to learn a language, right? And so it would be, but I certainly was not saying that focus on form has no place in such contexts. It does, right? But not necessarily in the context of pure task-based language teaching, right? I think one has got to look at task-supported language teaching, right? If you like, sort of PPP, and ask yourself whether in fact there is a place for task-supported language teaching and focus on form in the final P when they do the communicative task, etc. So to just correct, I'm not saying that focus on form has no place in Asia. I think it has a place in any type of language teaching, right? But one of the points of my talk was that focus on form can occur in task-supported language teaching as well as in task-based language teaching.
When people ask questions, would they say who they are? Because I read your stuff, but I don't know what you look like. I'm Amy Ota, and my question is, you've done a lot of work on explicit and implicit language learning processes, and could you pull together the explicit piece with the focus on form piece, for us?
problem with the word explicit is that it can be used in the context of some kind of explicit metalinguistic instruction that precedes the performance of any particular task, right? And that's what would happen in task-supported language teaching, where there would be some explicit explanation of some particular language point or some vocabulary, and then there would be various practice activities that would include a task, right? So that is one use of the term explicit. And I think that needs to be separated out from the idea of explicit focus on form procedures, because focus on form procedures must still be linked to the performance of a particular task, right? So one can have explicit focus on form procedures, such as a very quick metalinguistic explanation, right? Or direct explicit correction, right? And that would occur in the context of doing a particular task. I mean, this again is one of the problems with the terminology that we use in applied linguistics and in Islam. And the term explicit is being used in very different ways, yeah? The idea of some a priori explicit instruction is very different from the idea of explicit focus on form procedures that briefly, temporarily direct attention and form while learners are trying to communicate meaningfully.
With your, yeah. So in your use of focus on form, part of that is that it's shorter, you know, or it's integrated into integrated into use. But you did also mention in the PPP using a focus on form prior to. And so how would that be different from explicit instruction?
No, I mean, basically, I would say that task-supported language teaching is a type of explicit instruction. It is one type of explicit instruction. It is a type of explicit instruction that includes an opportunity for some kind of free production communicative activity. Okay? And is mainstream. I would say that that is essentially what mainstream language teaching is about. That's what we get in all the textbooks.
I'm Catherine Davies. I would like to ask you about what you would consider an ideal preparation for a language teacher, given that the teacher needs to be able to have access to information about English, about other languages, in order to have effective interventions in terms of focus on form. I teach linguistics classes to people who are in MAT-SOL, and that's part of why I'm asking.
Well, in terms of teacher preparation, I would be more interested in the methodological aspects of teacher preparation, rather than the more linguistic aspects of teacher preparation, right? And probably for teacher preparation courses, I would want teachers to be introduced to task-based language teaching, but also to understand the differences between task-based language teaching and task-supported language teaching, and to become aware and able to operate the kinds of focus on form procedures that we know are very important and have a role in both object-oriented language teaching, focus on forms, and more meaning-based language teaching, task-based language teaching. I also feel that one of the things that one needs to do in teacher preparation courses, particularly for teachers who are going to be teaching a language that is not their mother tongue, right? That's another reason why an introduction to task-based language teaching is very important. One of the reasons that is often given for the difficulty of introducing task-based language teaching into Asian countries is that teachers lack oral competence and therefore do not feel comfortable in doing task-based language teaching, right? one of the points I would want to get over in a teacher education course is one way that you as a teacher can become more proficient is actually by doing task-based language teaching, right? I mean, this is something that I think teachers do not always understand, and that is that through teaching, particularly through teaching primarily through the medium of the language you're teaching, you're not only hopefully improving your students' language, you're improving your own, right? And again, we don't really know very much about how teachers can improve their own oral proficiency in a language through teaching it.
All right, thanks for the talk. I just was wondering about the cognitive window. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Paul. I was wondering about the cognitive window. Now I know it's immediate, I know the definition of the cognitive window, about 60 seconds, where we can get both representations in working memory. But do you think, I think you contrasted it with focus on form after the communication.
Yeah.
Right? So I was curious if you think that we can reopen that window by kind of inducing communication again after the fact, as in delayed corrective feedback. If you use delayed corrective feedback in a certain way, you push the learner to re-communicate or attempt to re-communicate something. Is that window reopened, and would you call that form focus instruction, or would you still call it focus on forms?
I think this is a very interesting issue. It's to do with whether the focus on form should be immediate, occur within the context of the actual communicative activity, or whether it can be delayed and be handled remotely from the actual communicative activity. And one of the reasons I think it's interesting is because the idea of the cognitive window is that the attention to form occurs while the learner, while the student is primarily struggling with trying to express some kind of meaning, right? That's where the idea of the cognitive window comes in. So basically, the focus on form is linked to the idea of treating language as a tool for communicating. But if you extract the attention to form by delaying it until after the communicative activity is over, and then you proceed to present some of the linguistic problems that students had and suggest ways in which they might be able to deal with those, you are no longer treating the language as a communicative tool, you've gone back to treating it as an object, right? And this is another, I think, very important issue, is the extent to which language learning, as task-based language teaching would argue, occurs most effectively when language is treated as a tool for communicating, as opposed to when language is treated as an object to be studied, learnt, etc., right? And I think this remains one of the central and crucial questions, yeah? Mm-hmm. And this is perhaps again where I might differ a little bit from Michael Long, because I don't think I've ever rejected the idea that it is useful to treat language as an object, right? Not only that, but my own rather feeble efforts to learn languages, yeah? Both in context, in communicative contexts, and from a book or in a classroom. In both situations, I could never entirely remove myself from treating language as an object, some of the time. I think if you're an adult, it's almost impossible not to treat language as an object, yeah? And that must somehow feed into the learning process, right? So I'm not suggesting that treating language as an object, which is what happens if feedback is delayed as opposed to immediate, yeah? I think that it has value.
Okay, so because it's delayed, then you would say that the student or the learner is going to think, oh, we're dealing with language, or they're going to feel it's language as an object. You don't see the situation where you...
I think it's very difficult to recreate the real communicative situation from which the particular linguistic problem is extracted. The fact that you're extracting it in a delayed fashion means almost immediately that you're going to be treating language as an object.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Ron. Thank you. Sean Lowen. I suppose I'm a nephew here. one of the terms that was conspicuously absent from your talk, to my mind, was form-focused instruction, and I'm just wondering your opinion about how that fits into this terminological issues that we have.
Well, you know, that is, again, one of the underlying things that motivated my talk was the fact that we have these terms in applied linguistics, focus on forms, etc., and they're not stable, or at least the constructs that they label are not stable, they evolve, etc. So you've now introduced another term, another construct, form-focused instruction, yeah? And I think that if we were to look at how this term has been used over the 30 years of ISLA, we would find that the meaning of this has shifted and changed, etc., right? So all I can do is perhaps tell you how I would use that term. And I would use it as a cover term, yeah, to any attempt to teach the language. So in other words, in terms of focus on form and focus on forms, it would cover all of those procedures. Yeah? It's a generic cover term to cover any attempt to teach language as form, and not just as form, but also as form meaning mapping.
Thank you.
Well, what about you? What about you? Come on, you asked the question. Sean?
Well, I think in some of the writing that I've done on focus on form, I do see it as a cover term as well, with focus on form and focus on forms perhaps being more a continuum with where there can be different emphases on either form or meaning. But I would agree that I think form-focused instruction I would put sort of at a level with, contrast it with meaning-focused instruction as maybe two different, I don't know if I use the word approaches here, but two different approaches towards instruction, that then you have different procedures that have more or less attention to either form.
Okay. Well, I mean, if I interpret that similar to what I just said.
You agree with me, thanks.
I think.
I'm Miriam Eisenstein, Oxford. Thank you so much. I have to go home and take notes now. I'm not sure what kind of focus on form that is, but I will do my best. You really draw our attention to the importance of context in all of this research, and I think it was very appropriate to talk about different educational cultures and the fact that our students are members of educational cultures and have expectations, and their bosses have expectations, and so forth. So I wonder if you're aware of research, more research on the variables of student motivation, of the importance of grammatical accuracy or for different kinds of learners, and whether that's an important intervening variable in how effective the various kinds of focus on form might be.
Well, I mean, that's something I did not cover in my talk, but obviously there is a sort of psychological dimension to focus on form in terms of how various individual difference factors might mediate both the extent to which focus on form perhaps occurs and also what effect it might have on learning. So yeah, I would accept that motivation is potentially a very important factor, probably language aptitude as well. And there is some work that has looked, I mean, if you look around talks here, you'll begin to see that there's quite a lot of talks that are looking at individual difference factors and how they're mediating different aspects of instruction, etc. So yes, the research is there. I still think it's quite limited, in fact. I mean, maybe Roy, work on corrective feedback. We know that individual difference factors are likely to mediate the extent to which learners can benefit from different types of corrective feedback, right? But there's not that much research that's looked at it, or am I wrong? You're right. That's a relief.
Hi everyone, I'm Xiaoyan from TC here. Hi, Professor Ellis. I have a question. So in your talk, you mentioned that it is difficult to implement TBLT, in particular in Asian context. So you also mentioned the word compromise. So my question is, do you see task-supported language teaching as a midway towards the more or purer TBLT in the future? Or do you think it's an empirical question that maybe in that foreign language teaching context, TBLT is as effective, or task-supported language teaching is as effective as TBLT?
Do I think it's as effective? I don't know.
So it's an empirical question.
I mean,
because you use the word compromise,
the
so I was thinking that...
The curriculum model that I think is more appropriate, I mean, I am an advocate of task-based language teaching, so I don't want what I've said today to suggest that I'm not a supporter and advocate of task-based language teaching. I'm very much an advocate. But I think it's extremely unlikely that in many of the Asian contexts that I find myself working with teachers, that I'm going to convince them to do task-based language teaching all the time. I mean, they're constrained by their parents, they're constrained by the kinds of tests they have to do, by the attitudes of their students, and perhaps their own beliefs as well. So what increasingly I think might work in Asia is a modular curriculum, right, where there are two separate components, one of which would be predominantly task-based, would be task-based language teaching, but we would say you don't have to do it all the time. There will be other classes, other lessons, where you can adopt perhaps somewhat more traditional approach, focus on forms approach, right? Task-supported language teaching, as opposed to task-based language teaching. So, I mean, I think what is interesting for Asia is to how we could move along to create such a modular curriculum. I think that would have a much greater chance of being accepted by both policymakers, teachers, and students, etc.
But will that lead to pure task-based language teaching in the future, or it will actually stay like that? So my question is like, yes, I understand that is more for practical reasons why we want to introduce more task-supported language teaching. So what do you see as in the future? Will the teacher and learners' conceptualization about language learning changes so that they will open up spaces for true or pure task-based language teaching in the future?
I go back to what I said, which is that with older learners, I don't think you're ever going to stop them treating language as an object some of the time, right? I think if they treat language as an object all the time, that's going to be very limiting in terms of the development of communicative ability, which should be perhaps the major goal of language teaching, right? So I repeat that I basically feel that some kind of modular syllabus, one is where teachers are educated, trained to be able to do pure task-based language teaching, but they don't do it all the time. There are other activities that they do in some classes for homework, for students, etc., that treat language more as an object, yeah? And I think that has a much greater chance of being accepted, yeah? Not only that, but I think it is compatible with how I think languages are learned. I don't think languages are learned purely through communication. I think languages are also, to use Krashen's terms, learned as well as acquired, right? And that both processes are actually important, yeah? One of the problems in Asia is that there's been too much emphasis on language as an object, not enough emphasis on language as a tool, right? Although I think that is changing gradually and slowly, yeah? So yeah, I do want to see pure task-based language teaching practiced, particularly, for example, in elementary schools. In all these Asian countries, we're finding English being introduced into the primary school. You know, I dread the thought that it's going to be taught in the same way as it's taught in sort of high school traditionally. Yeah? There's a great need for task-based language teaching. Yeah? But what I'm saying is that I'm not convinced that the whole curriculum should be task-based language teaching.
I think another light issue here is type of learning that takes place in a typical classroom. You ask yourself one simple question. What type of learning takes place in a formal classroom setting? And you have the answer. Focus on form was premised on incidental conditions, incidental learning conditions. And it slipped into the implicit learning condition. And then became implicit and explicit. The question is, ask yourself again the question, what type of learning takes place in a classroom setting? Bottom line is, 99% is explicit learning. And you have to wrap that around to understand where you have to interpret these studies. Whether all these studies on focus on form, focus, instruction, whatever you call it, look at the gain scores of the study. Would you take those so-called studies, findings, and plump them into a classroom setting? Or kids can get an F. That's reality. No Caribbean stuff there.
We'll have someone from this side. This side's been dominating, so you have to hang on to it.
Hello, my name's Rebecca Chow. I haven't written anything, so don't try to find me. So I was particularly interested in your mention that there hasn't been much research done on how focus on form affects procedural and declarative memory, and then we also, a couple questions back, you did mention the idea that individual differences may play a part in this. There's a question in here, I just haven't figured out how to state it. So I'm particularly interested in individual differences in procedural and declarative memory, as well as implicit versus explicit knowledge, based on the idea that Dr. Ullman proposes. Grammar is particularly procedural, which means, how do I want to put this? In focus on form, the focus is on communicating until there is a point, usually reactionary, as you said, usually, in which there needs to be some kind of explicit instruction or correction, whereas the rest is, what's the word? Production. You have the students talk, you have the students do tasks until there's a point that we need to do focus on form, which means, I know there's a question in here, I can't figure out how to put it. If we're looking at proceduralizing skills as coming from repetition and exposure, the most repetition and exposure these students are getting is when the focus on form is not happening. Does that make sense? Well, when the reactionary bit isn't happening, they're producing their
Focus on form is a highlighting device. It's going to highlight certain forms in relation to a particular meaning in context.
Yes, okay, so I guess what I mean to say is until the highlighting occurs, it is arguably incidental or implicit in the way that we're going about this teaching method.
No.
Okay.
Yeah, that's been, I think, one of the changes that has taken place, that initially I think Michael Long did conceptualize focus on form as being incidental, brief, etc., right?
Okay.
But if you look to how he's writing about it now in his 2015 work, and I would go along with that, he's now seeing it as involving both implicit, incidental techniques and much more explicit, intentional type techniques, right? It can involve both. It's a much broader concept now.
I guess then my overall question is, if instruction overall, whether it's focus on forms, most instruction does happen fairly explicitly, and I guess taps declarative memory more so than procedural memory. How
do we reconcile, or how do we push the students from having declarative and explicit understandings of language, or what, as you would say, language as an object, to proceduralizing it as a skill?
Well, I think that, yeah, all right, you got to the question. Well done. I think that is one of the underlying rationales to focus on form. That because it's occurring in the cognitive window, it can help this process by which people move from more declarative type knowledge to more procedural knowledge, right? This in particular was the argument that de Keyser's made, right? In the context of skill building theory, that asking people to perform an activity which involves what he calls real operating conditions, yeah? And then drawing attention to particular linguistic forms while they're doing that is going to help the proceduralization and automatization processes, right? And I think a similar thing in Michael Long's version of Focus on Form. The focus on form is directed in trying to help people develop procedural implicit knowledge, etc. Does it work? I don't know. I think that is one of the big issues, because some of the studies that I've been doing with with Xiaofeng Li recently suggest that perhaps focus on form does not necessarily result in sort of procedural implicit type knowledge, but actually helps to develop explicit knowledge. And I think that continues to be an actual major issue. To what extent does focus on form, yeah, actually help to develop proceduralized, automatic, implicit type knowledge?
My name is Aline Godfrey. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hi, Rod. And I think, yeah, I'd like to continue on the previous question, and also there were echoes before also about how English language testing might be shaping the type of language instruction that takes place in certain parts of Asia, and then implicit, explicit. And so in your presentation, I think, at least implicit, there was a call, I mean, partly implicit, partly explicit, right? There was a call for more comparative research, comparing focus on forms research. You had 2 papers,
yeah.
Also Sheen and Shintani. And so you have, of course, written this oft-cited paper about the psychometric study where you are validating 5 measures of implicit and explicit knowledge.
Right.
And my personal view is that we need more measures of...
Agreed.
I haven't finished my sentence yet. But of implicit knowledge, right? That we need more measures of implicit knowledge, better measures, more valid measures, and some of us have been working on that. Now, my question is the following. Which measures of implicit knowledge, we have a number of them now, but which ones do you think are particularly suitable and valid when we are studying ISLA, so when we are studying language learners in a second language classroom setting, as opposed to perhaps a laboratory setting?
Which measures are likely to be able to shed light on whether there are gains in implicit knowledge?
Yes.
Well, as you know, this is what motivated my work on measures of implicit and explicit learning. It was motivated entirely by the fact that if we want to find out what effect instruction has on learning, we need to be able to have measures that we have some confidence can measure implicit knowledge as opposed to explicit knowledge, right? So in that study, we, as you well know, we identified a number of measures that we thought might perhaps give an indication of implicit knowledge, and other measures explicit knowledge, right? So the implicit ones, we looked at 3 measures, right? We looked at the elicited oral imitation test, which is probably the one that is being caught on most in subsequent research. right? And we looked at an oral narrative, which actually in many ways, if you looked at the factor analysis, had the highest loadings on that particular factor that we labeled implicit, yeah, the oral narrative task. And then thirdly, we looked at a time grammaticality judgment test, which also loaded. So if you look at the loadings, the highest loading for the implicit factor was the oral narrative task. And one advantage of the oral narrative task is it has very high face validity, yeah? Because if ultimately you are interested in whether people can use the language in a communicative way, then perhaps the best way to do that is to look at whether they can actually perform a communicative type task, etc. Right? I think that, what I have, going back to that research, I'm no longer convinced that those measures measured implicit knowledge, right? As opposed to, say, proceduralized, automatized explicit knowledge. This is de Keyser's point, yeah? And I've taken that on board, yeah? And I don't know to what extent we can find tests of does it really matter? Does it matter whether we are actually measuring automatized explicit knowledge or whether we are measuring something called implicit knowledge? From a theoretical point of view, yes, it does, right? But from a practical point of view of measuring the effects of explicit instruction on the kind of knowledge that learners develop, maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe it will be very difficult to ever completely develop a set of tests, yeah, unless we go into neurolinguistic type research. It would be very difficult to develop a set of tests that will distinguish between automatized explicit knowledge and true implicit knowledge. But I'm interested in your thoughts.
Well, my thoughts were, in this case, coming more from the language classroom. So, in the sense that we are working, right, towards finding more valid measures of implicit knowledge, and I think that's an important endeavor to be pursuing. But my question today was coming more from a language teacher's perspective. So many of these tasks, which may be measuring implicit knowledge to varying degrees, we can debate that some other time, but I think are very hard to implement by language teachers.
Well, yeah, I thought about this as well. And again, something I don't think there's been much work on, but what I would be quite interested in, is it's very difficult for language teachers to test pre-production, right? Because you've got to do it individually, and it's extremely difficult to do it if you've got large classes such as you have in Asia, right? So what I was wondering is, could we develop listening tasks that tap into proceduralized ability, etc.? And could we show that performance on such listening tasks do produce a reasonably high correlation or reasonably predictive of people's actual speaking abilities? Because it would be possible with large classes, in the kinds of contexts that you're talking about, to use listening tasks to tap into people's proceduralized knowledge, etc. But in order to satisfy ourselves that what we were measuring had some kind of relationship to communicative production, we would need to know that it does. And I don't think we have those studies, actually. But that would be my solution. When teachers say to me, how can I test whether my students are developing proceduralized communicative abilities in a large class, of course we can't give each student a free production task and assess their production. We can't do it. So I moved to suggesting maybe they should use meaning-based listening tasks. What do you think? What's your solution for the problem?
I don't have one, so I've been working in my lab, right, as you know, so...
I know. You come to ask a question about classrooms, not about the lab. I don't know. I mean, that's the only way that I think we could go. I think that we should look very closely at the relationship between learners' performance on listening tasks that tap into proceduralized knowledge and oral production communicative ability.
Thank you, Rob.
Okay, we have about 5 more minutes. One quick question. I don't know if I can find any curriculum that asks for students that will be able to demonstrate metalinguistic or procedural or declarative knowledge. It simply asks students will talk about something. So whether type of knowledge is important or not for the classroom setting, that's another issue. We have one more person here, one more person. Punto final. One final.
So, I can't even battle about the question. Sorry. So, what I want to ask is your stance, if you have one, as to non-native speaking English teachers' effectiveness in focus on form. So, and what I mean by that is, I'm from Turkey. I taught EFL for a few years, and my dissertation data comes from EFL classroom recordings, where I see a lot of the teachers, unfortunately, providing wrong forms in their feedback, or speaking the language ungrammatically, or pronouncing things wrong. But in all of the research I have read so far, and that doesn't mean much, I haven't passed or taken my comps yet, so. But it seems like the teachers are assumed to speak the language with the correct, using the correct forms of whatever English they teach. But we are supposedly teaching American English in the institution that I collected my data from, which is also where I used to work. But it's definitely not American English, but it's not in any way standard. Like, teachers are making mistakes, and focus on form, corrective feedback. We're all trying to see the most effective way that will lead to SLA, the acquisition. But how is that going to happen when the teachers haven't acquired the language themselves yet?
SLA does not mean the acquisition of native speaker target forms. SLA means the acquisition of whatever particular interlanguage system you are exposed to. And we know now that there is a huge moment, and English is a lingua franca, etc., to accept that the target should not necessarily be standard American grammatical English, etc., right? And I don't think it matters, because if the aim is ultimately that learners will develop some type of communicative ability, competence to communicate, right? The fact that they're using some grammatical forms that are not grammatical, yeah, because they got them from their teacher, as long as they can still use them to communicate with some success, then I still feel that the teaching is doing a worthwhile job. Okay? I mean, teachers can only they can only focus on form in terms of their own interlanguage system, right? That seems to me absolutely fine. You see, you're measuring acquisition in terms of whether people are acquiring target language American grammatical forms, and I don't think that that is an appropriate measure of acquisition.
I agree, and I know about the lingua franca core and its intelligibility that matters. ALF is now more prevalent in around the globe, like more non-native speakers speaking to each other, etc. But that's not the product they're selling, and that's not the product the students are buying.
Well, you know, I mean, I go back to the two things I've been talking about. You can treat language as an object, you can treat it as a tool. In order to become an effective communicator in a second language, you've got to experience using it as a tool. If you don't experience using it as a tool, you'll never develop confidence and ability to communicate, right? So a lot of teaching has got to provide a context where we can actually help people to treat it as a tool. But I've also argued that learners are not going to stop treating it as an object. So the answer to your solution is that some of the teaching that teachers do will treat language as a tool. If they do focus on form, maybe they will not use target language forms, right, when they're doing corrective feedback, yeah? But if there's also opportunities for them to treat language as an object, yeah, that is where they can actually look at the target language forms. And slowly, over time, gradually, because language is a hugely complex thing, gradually the two might come together.
So you're,
I think we've got to move on.
I think we're running out of
Yeah.
time.
Very quick.
Very quickly. Thanks very much.
Hi there, my name is Joshua Stark, and I have a question. You talked about the procedural aspect of focus on form and focus on forms, and how incidental is really kind of where we treat this focus on form and focus on forms. But then preemption as a sort of evolution of the reactionary nature of it. And so I'm wondering, and you talked about questions and answers as a site for preemption. And is that the only site for the preemption?
Well, what we found when we looked at what we call preemptive focus on form is that from the point of view of students, yes, they do ask questions about particular form. Should I use this tense? Is this the right word? Etc. And they do it, right? When it comes to the teacher doing preemptive focus on form, then sometimes the teacher would ask a question to try to get them to think about, do they need to use a particular form? Sometimes the teacher would give advice, remember past tense here, etc. So there were a variety of preemptive strategies, yeah? I think actually we published an article in TESOL Quarterly looking at these preemptive strategies, yeah? So there are a variety of preemptive strategies that can be used. I don't think focus on form is just reactive. That's one area where I would differ from Michael Long.
Okay, thank you all for coming to this stimulating discussion, and I hope you're all hungry and going to eat.
Yeah.